So welcome everybody to another episode of Lionheart's Discipleship, and we're very blessed to be joined by our first priest as a guest, and we've got Father Richard Wallace with us today. Welcome, Father. How are you?
Hey, Chris. Pretty good. Honored to be here. Thanks for having me on. It's my first podcast ever, so I'm pretty excited.
Well, we'll see how we go, but hopefully the first of many.
Yes.
So as this podcast comes out, we are in the midst of Lent. I don't want to wait too long in Lent to get the podcast out. So this is me keeping myself accountable to that. And we're talking about the virtue of fortitude, the cardinal virtue of fortitude. One that is really, I'd say, the spiritual and theological foundation for why I started making this podcast in the first place. And a cardinal virtue is something that should be important to all of us. But I think it's particularly important to you as well, Father. So thanks for coming on and talking to us about fortitude.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to do it, and happy to spread the knowledge of virtue.
Absolutely. And we'll see how we go. But as I said, fortitude is a cardinal virtue. So there are sub virtues, which Father will talk to us about. And we probably will be doing separate episodes on the sub virtues underneath fortitude. So we'd like to take this opportunity to do an overview of what fortitude is and why it's so important. I think that other cardinal virtues maybe get a little bit more airtime in conversation, in sermons and homilies that we may hear. And we want to talk more about fortitude and why it's so important. I have found personally in my own life that conquering inordinate fears has been extremely important to my growth as a person, as a Catholic man, as a husband and a father, and in my relationship with God, just living out my faith. I found it probably to be the most important, or the virtue that when I've tried to work on it, it's brought me the most noticeable progress. Maybe that's because my key weaknesses have all been around fear, and not everyone's the same. But I get the feeling that we are living in a world where there are a lot of subtle fears pressurizing us in many ways that we don't even realize. And so a focus on fortitude can help us to begin tackling and overcoming those things, and therefore growing in leaps and bounds in our walk as Christians and Catholics. So, Father, would you like to give us a basic definition of fortitude, what it is and what it's not, and why it's a cardinal virtue?
Yeah, of course. So to know what fortitude is, we have to know what the cardinal virtues are, first of all. The cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And these are called cardinal because they are like the hinge virtues, which contain many other virtues. These are like really basic and foundational virtues. Let's make it very clear that they are necessary for us if we want to get through the battles of this life. They're like our weaponry, our arsenal of virtues. Unlike faith, hope, and charity, which concern God himself, you believe in God, you hope in God, you love God. These virtues concern the road to God. So you're prudent in daily matters. You have to be just towards people. You have to show fortitude against fear. And you have to have temperance against undue passion. So these are basically our weapons on the road to God, on the road to heaven. Now, fortitude is simply defined as the virtue which regulates our fear so that it doesn't become inordinate. Let's call it that. It's not the official definition, but it's the one that's pretty easy to understand. It's the virtue which regulates our fear. And that's going to lead us to even a prior question, though. Fear. Is fear a bad thing or a good thing? Well, it's basically, it depends on what the fear is about. Fear is part of us. It's part of the powers of our soul. So we can't just say fear is good, fear is bad. It depends on what its object is. What are we fearing? Because sometimes, some places, we should fear things. But in other situations, we shouldn't fear things. And if we do, it's called inordinate fear. It's fear where there shouldn't be fear. And in Saint Thomas Aquinas, when he's treating about all these training of all these virtues, he goes to great lengths to list the opposing vices of these virtues, to show how a virtue, if it's not cultivated correctly, it can easily fall to one extreme or to the other extreme, and then it's not a virtue anymore, it's a vice, actually. So I'm saying a lot here, but let me just say one more thing about moral virtues, which is super important to know. Moral virtue observes the golden mean. What does that mean, the golden mean? So it basically means that virtue is a mean between two extremes. Imagine a far left on a scale, then a far right on the scale. What true virtue is going to be somewhere between that far right and far left. It's going to observe a mean. And when it breaks that mean, it either becomes one extreme, which is the extreme lack of the virtue, which is actually a vice, or the other extreme, which is an excess of the virtue, which is in reality not even the virtue anymore. It's just a vice. So virtue has to have a balance. Let's just say that. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there because I'll keep going forever. Just so. Yeah. What do you think?
And from memory, Father, with the golden mean, because that is something that came to mind to me before we came on here, is that you've got fortitude or courage on the golden mean, and then I think on the deficient side you've got cowardice, and on the excess side you've got foolhardiness. Is that correct?
Yeah, foolhardiness, or sometimes it's called recklessness.
So, yeah, sure.
Let's give an example to show this. So in the early church, in the martyrdom of Polycarp, we read about a certain man named Quintus. Quintus the apostate. That's what he's known by for all of Christianity, basically. That's not the name to be known by, but Quintus the apostate. He only gets one paragraph mention, and it's not a good thing. It says this, that there was a certain Quintus, a Phrygian, who in the persecutions, first of all, decided to turn himself in to the Roman authorities on purpose, present himself in and say, I'm going to be a martyr, I'm going to do this. But then once he did that, and he was going to be martyred, he saw the beasts and the lions that are going to use to kill him, and he got so scared, he said, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'll sacrifice to your false gods. Please save my life. So in this story of Quintus the apostate, we have both of the extremes of fortitude, actually. There's no fortitude. There's the extreme. We see his excess, first of all, when he presented himself to the authorities for no good reason. The church has always taught that you shouldn't go just seeking martyrdom. That's what he did. He fell into the vice of foolhardiness or recklessness. But then once he did that, and he was just on the verge of being martyred, and he saw the lions, he said, I can't do this anymore. He fell into the vice of cowardice, where he said, I'll sacrifice to your gods, please save my life. So that's a good way to illustrate the extremes of fortitude, which are fortitude.
I haven't heard an example like that where somebody, within a matter of a day oscillated from one extreme to the other. So that is a very good example. It makes me think, referencing back to the early church. And I remember listening to a talk from a Catholic conference a few years ago. I was at uni, and the talk was, what did the early Christian martyrs have that we don't have today? And that was the whole talk. And I remember feeling so inspired by this talker talking about like how they lived out their lives in the early church. And yeah, well, they weren't seeking out martyrdom, and yet for so many of them who were chosen to be martyred, they persevered until the end. And it's hard to, I don't know if it's just the comfort that we've lived in our generation, and that the only persecution that most, in the West at least, that most Christians know would be verbal persecution. Sometimes it's political slurs and things like that, but we haven't felt physical ostracization in many ways yet. So maybe that's part of the problem, but I don't know. What would you say, Father, about what the early Christian martyrs had that we don't have now, that we probably need to work on?
Yeah, that's a good question. What did they have that we don't have? I think we're too comfortable in our 21st century Western society. So we're too comfortable. We think that we've made all this human progress and solved all these problems. So a lot of time we're seeking comfort. Now, not to say that all the early Christians had great fortitude, because a lot of them didn't. We have to say that. We can't put them into one big group. Like all early Christians were saints. Well, that's not true. We read in the Acts of the early Christians that there are these Christians called traditores who handed over the sacred books to the Roman authorities to be burned. And that was a cowardly thing to do. But many of them did it, and they fell into cowardice. But many as well had great fortitude during those early centuries of the faith. It's we should know this, Chris, that martyrdom is the highest act of fortitude, the absolute highest act of fortitude. And it's funny that in the Roman Missal, at least in the 1962 Missal, because I celebrate the Latin Mass, the sort of saints with more feasts than anyone else, they're martyrs. So martyrs have the biggest place in the Roman Missal. And really, they always have. So in the 1962 Missal, for example, we have 127 feast days of martyrs throughout the year. Now, that's a really big number. That's the biggest out of all the classes of, virgins or confessors or popes. So this is the church trying to say something to us here. That, look at, fortitude is really important. That's why we celebrate the feast days of these martyrs so often.
Absolutely.
So that's just something that I've come to learn in celebrating Mass and following the liturgical year.
And what would you say, Father, about the relationship between nature and grace? In that, what I'm thinking of is how I've often heard people, like I remember when I first began to take my faith seriously, and I think I was asking a priest or somebody who was more experienced in the spiritual life than me about the martyrs, and just saying like, I feel like if somebody came and dragged me before whatever kind of long-lasting torture form that they may choose to inflict upon me to try and get me to recant my faith, I said, I can't imagine in my current state being able to persevere in that to the point of death. Like I just know from my own previous experience that my pain threshold is terrible and that they could probably make me crack pretty easily. And they said to me, but there's a grace of martyrdom, like when the moment is before you and when God knows that this is the moment where this is going to be the final test, there's a grace there, and you can't experience and you can't feel what that grace would feel like now, just hypothesizing about it. So there's that on one hand, but then on the other hand, there's the fact that we can do things in our lives to grow in fortitude. Can you speak to the relationship between those two things? Like, should we be at a particular level of fortitude before that grace is going to work well with our nature, or can we just say, okay, God's going to make it work for us? We don't have to do anything. How do you strike that balance?
We can't say the latter thing, that God's just going to make it work for us, but at the same time, we can't presume that that I'm going to be a martyr someday. It's basically a balance. It's a balance here. That I think this is the great principle. We have to be faithful to every little thing. Our Lord says that he who is faithful to that which is least is faithful to that which is greater. So this is the perfection, I think, the perfect mixture of nature and grace here. Because by our nature, we are capable of we're more capable, at least, of being faithful to small things, because that's how weak we are. We can't even do big things. Let's just do small things well. At the same time, this is where grace is absolutely perfected, because to be faithful to small things is actually a big thing, a work of God's grace itself. So really, as long as anyone is being absolutely faithful to every little thing, I would say that he can be confident, not presumptuous, but confident that when a big thing comes, God is going to give him the grace to withstand it and say the right thing or do the right thing in that moment.
Yeah, and I would say on top of that, that everybody has the opportunity to be faithful in small things every day. And I think you could probably deduce from that God's preparing us, all of us, to be faithful to a big thing at some point in our life. It might not be a bloody martyrdom. It might be white martyrdom, or another great sacrifice which we may have not been able to make without being faithful in the small things.
Yeah, correct, Chris, definitely.
And would you care to share any stories from your own life, Father, of how you've grown in the virtue of fortitude?
I think one of the most difficult things I've had to do in my life was go to the seminary, because I suffered from grave homesickness when I went to the seminary. Like when I went, the day I flew to the seminary on the airplane, I was crying on the airplane. And if anyone in our audience has ever experienced homesickness, they know how bad it is. It's just this feeling that, like, what's going to happen to my life? It's like you're walking in utter darkness and you don't know what's going to happen. So it's a difficult thing. It causes fear because you don't know, like, oh, am I going to see my family again? And everything I had in the past, is it just gone forever? And it took me probably 2 or 3 years to overcome that homesickness. It took me a long time. But now I see, and we're going to talk about this in the next episode, I grew in the virtue of magnanimity. That is, I learned how to do a great thing for God, to be a seminarian, to be a priest. And here I am now in Australia, the furthest place away from America, doing his work now. And I'm so happy that I made that choice. But imagine if I never made it. If I just said, oh, it's too much for me. I'm just going to stay home in Phoenix for the rest of my life. Well, I wouldn't be doing great things for God. So it was a really difficult experience, overcoming homesickness, but I grew a lot in fortitude.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. That's a beautiful story. I have a few of my own, and maybe I'll space them out over the series. The one that came to mind for me first when I was just reflecting over the questions that we'd be discussing was when I left school. I did a year of youth ministry, 2 years of youth ministry actually, but during the first year in particular, I had to battle a fear of public speaking. I didn't realize how bad my fear of public speaking actually was, but when I reflected back over the fact that whenever I had to give any kind of speech or oral presentation at school, I'd take up notes with me and I would start shaking. Like I would be up in front of the class and I would start shaking, and I didn't know how to stop. Like I didn't know how to make myself stop shaking. And I thought, no, okay, like I really felt called to do that youth ministry. I wanted to go into high schools and tell young people that our Lord had changed my life, which is absolutely true. But then I realized that, oh, hang on, sharing something really vulnerable and personal, that's scary. Like when I came to actually start preparing one of these talks, and the first talk I gave, it was really difficult, and there was some shaking. And the other thing that I noticed about myself is that I would ramble. Like if I didn't know how to fill in a pause, I got really insecure about the fact that there was a pause in what I was saying, and so I would just ramble. And I realized that was part of the fear too. So anyway, I went back to the drawing board and I thought, okay, I've got to do something about this. And I found the next talk that I was scheduled to give was a talk very similar to the ones that Jason Evert gives. So Jason Evert, he's the chastity speaker, talks about purity and relationships, all of that. And I was scheduled to give a talk on that topic, which is even more personal than the last talk that I had to give. And so I started really studying him, I started really watching the way that he presented, the way that he engaged. He was funny. His analogies were really good and relevant. And he was obviously so confident in what he was sharing and that it was true. And that, at least for a portion of the audience, it was going to hit home. Like it was just clear that he was so confident about those things. And so I actually kind of tried to teach myself to imbibe his qualities in my presentation. And so I started practicing in front of the mirror, which is something also that I was even too scared to practice in front of the mirror before, because I just hated talking so much. But I started doing it, and I almost had to kind of put myself into character, like kind of fake it until I made it. And it came to the time where I had to give this talk to a youth group, and I nailed it. I wasn't scared at all. I was confident. I knew exactly what I was talking about. And I had all my analogies in place, all my metaphors, everything that I wanted to do. The jokes, the jokes were responded to well. And so, in reflection on that, I think there's something really to be said about having role models in virtue. And I think it's really particularly true with courage, because courage is something that is observable. When someone is, especially when it's a presentation, right? Like in presentation, you can tell if someone's being courageous through their confidence, the level of confidence that they have. And so you can just start to mimic until you start to believe it yourself, and then you say, oh, hang on, this is actually fun. So that was my story. After that, I was never scared to give a talk again. I proved to myself, and I trusted God with it, and it came through.
It's a beautiful story, Chris. And with role models, it's true that we learn virtue through role models. Any virtue, we learn it through them. But when it comes down to it, there's a very profound thesis to this, that really Christ is the role model, because he is the exemplar of all virtues. So all people who have learned virtues, supernatural virtues, have learned them through Christ.
Yeah.
Because he is the exemplar of all virtues. We have to admit that. So we go to him when it comes down to it, and he comes to us through people. So you learned of Christ through Jason Evert. But really, Jason Evert owes his virtue to Christ in the first place, through a chain of other people that formed him.
Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of the body of Christ. I mean, that's ideally the way that the church is supposed to work.
Yeah, definitely.
And you gave an example too of obviously somebody who got it wrong in history with Quintus, the apostate. Can you give maybe a story or two of saints who particularly grew in the virtue of fortitude?
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you two examples. One is an older example, another is a newer example, but both are nuns.
Cool.
So in the 1800s, you have Saint Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini. She was an Italian who went to America and did some great work in America with her religious order. Actually, she didn't want to go to America, first of all. She was in Italy, and she had this great idea to do this mission work. So she went to the Pope and asked if she can go to China. Now, why China? Well, you have to know about her life. So when she was 7 years old, she almost drowned. And since 7 years old, she had a great fear of water. She was scared of water. So it's easier to ask to go to China from Italy than to go to America from Italy. Water, crossing the ocean.
Yeah.
But what did the Pope tell her? He said, "You're not going to China. You're going to America." So this nun had to, in the course of her life, cross the ocean like 30 times. 30 times, and overcome that fear for the purpose of serving God. And I'm sure it was a very difficult thing to do, especially because traveling back then wasn't like jumping on, a cruise ship now or going on an airplane. It was difficult stuff. So that's the first story. The second one is not as much a story, just as a modern fact. The fact that in Gaza right now, in the war that's happening there are missionaries of charity that decided to stay there to help the orphans. Simple as that.
Wow. Yeah.
And
it's just happening every day.
Yeah, it does happen. We just don't really take notice of it. I know it's easy for us to just kind of, look over and, oh, I would do that too. Well, would you really do that too? Would you really stay there and take care of the orphans? That's a difficult thing. But they're doing it. Great act of fortitude. Heroic act of fortitude.
And Father, so with people who live more normal or everyday lives, in bridging the gap between this heroic virtue, this heroic courage, and us and our everyday, the small things that we can be faithful to, I haven't given this idea too much thought, but I'll share it anyway. I thought it might be useful, and tell me what you think, to develop something of an examination of conscience particular to fortitude. So what you can do with that is, break open fortitude and its sub virtues, but then have some pointed questions. And maybe this is in a pamphlet or a small book, or it's an online resource or something like that. But have some pointed questions that help people to identify what the fears, the inordinate fears that have the biggest stronghold in their lives are. And then from that, somehow come up with some actions that we can do to push back against those every day. What do you think?
I think that's a really good examination of conscience to make, especially using the virtues we're going to talk about in the next few episodes. The reason I haven't given many examples yet in fortitude itself is because St. Thomas says that fortitude itself really concerns big things. He even goes so far as to say life and death things.
Okay.
So we usually, if we want to be proper, like absolutely proper in speaking of virtues the way St. Thomas does, fortitude really concerns things about life and death, martyrdom or war or things like that. It's when we get into the sub-virtues that are connected to it, that's when we start to really speak about smaller things. And I'll give some more examples to make it clear how we can practice this in everyday life. But by extension, just to make it simple, we can call all of it fortitude. We don't always have to be so precise to say, well, I'm going to practice the virtue of munificence today or magnanimity. You can just call it fortitude. It's fine.
Yeah. So I guess you could look at it like a tree kind of thing, and well, fortitude's the precious fruit that comes, in due season, but there's also leaves and branches and a trunk. I don't know.
Yeah, correct.
Hmm. Yeah, fantastic. And Father, I'm doing this a bit backwards here, but I actually like to get guests who come onto this show to give some of their own story, their own testimonial, or perhaps even you might call it vocation story. So maybe we'll do it the other way around on this episode and have you do it towards the end now.
Surprise, audience.
Yeah.
Just change it up.
Well, everyone who's watching can see that Father's a priest, and I'm sure as we move on with the series that they'd like to know a little bit more about you and how you came to be an American priest in Australia.
Yes, interesting. So, I'll tell you about who I am now. So, I'm a priest of the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter. We are a society of apostolic life. We were founded in 1988 by Pope St. John Paul II. And our charism, our goal, the purpose of our existence is to be holy priests through the celebration of the Mass and the sacraments accordingly as they existed in 1962. It's just a fancy way of saying this. We celebrate the Latin Mass, and that is what we use to make us holy. And we believe that in becoming holy priests, the people under our care will be better off, and they'll become holy as well. So I'm part of the Fraternity of St. Peter, the FSSP as we're shortened, FSSP. My vocation story is quite simple, really, but grace-filled. I attribute my vocation to two things: my mother and altar serving. So my mom always taught us catechism when we were growing up on Sundays, and I remember when I was about 9 or 10, she taught me the importance of following God's will in life and praying to know God's will. She told me that if I pray and I pray, asking God what He wants me to do in life, He will tell me, and I'll be happy doing that thing. So I began to pray about it, and in the meantime, I read a biography of St. John Vianney, which really impressed me. And I remember being at Mass one day when I was about 10 or 11 and seeing the priest say Mass, and I had this, it was more like a premonition, which usually doesn't have a good connotation, that I would have to be a priest someday. And it really was a premonition. I was like, I'll probably have to be a priest. Oh man, okay, that's boring. But as the big change happened actually when I was 15. I started serving at the Latin Mass. And once I started doing that, I got really serious into altar serving because you have to learn the responses in Latin. You have to be really still, like almost soldier-like up there on the altar. Seeing the priest say Mass, he looked very, very, very heroic. So that really is the thing that like made that seed grow inside of me. And by the time I was 16 or 17, I started thinking, oh, what am I going to do now after I finish high school? And I decided, okay, maybe monastic life, maybe priesthood. So I visited a monastery. But it wasn't for me. So I went to the seminary and I was happy there. Here's another example of fortitude, actually, because that's my whole vocation story. Just one more example of fortitude.
Yeah.
I would, it's more natural for me to be in a monastery, actually. Because I'm a quiet person. I don't mind being alone. I'm not the most social person on the planet.
Yeah.
It would be
So
natural
God's
for me to
calling
be.
you outside of yourself, basically.
Yeah, exactly. He's calling me outside myself. He's saying it's too easy for you to do that. You have to push yourself. Go out and socialize, deal with people, do all those difficult things. And they are difficult at times, but I've really grown a lot. So it required fortitude for that, and still does.
I think about that with with my family a bit, and it was so funny because before we had children, people who know me well, who knew me growing up, especially, so my parents, my sister, they say I would have been a really good dad to girls because, Chris, you're sensitive and you're compassionate and you're empathetic, and people know me like that. And so now I have 4 boys. And it's not like I didn't want boys. Like, I'm really happy with what I have, but I just think it's so funny because it's like against what would come more naturally to me to kind of talk more and stuff like that. But now it's like wrestling every day. I like it actually, but it still called me forth from what I thought of myself or what other people thought of me.
God's ways are not man's ways.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Absolutely. And Father, can I also ask you, because the reason for everyone who's listening that we came up with this idea to do a series on Fortitude is because I was talking to Father Wallace in Spiritual Direction about how I started Lionheart's discipleship and, my passion for an apostle that would focus on this virtue. And he told me that he had just preached a homily about Fortitude. And so it just seemed provident, right, that we were speaking at that moment, especially because I hadn't actually caught up with you for a long time. Now, what motivated you to even begin preaching specifically on breaking open the virtue of fortitude?
I can't remember. I've been preaching about it for a few years, actually, on and
Yeah,
off.
great. Okay.
So I just took it out again from my bag of sermons and updated it.
Cool.
And St. Paul is talking about it that weekend in the epistle. He said, "Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil by good."
Yeah.
So I said, okay, fortitude. People
Sounds
like
good.
it too. It's really well received when I preach about fortitude.
Yeah, I think so. And I think people realize, and maybe I think there is some things unique to the age that we're living in, where in the past, before the media was so much a part of people's lives, I think there wouldn't have been so much fear in people's minds all the time, and therefore also in people's hearts all the time. But now we have a media culture that's geared around making us do things based off of fear.
Yeah,
And I think people of prayer, like people who, but this is what I mean, people who take time to step away from the noise and the busyness of those messages and pray and, actually say, God, what do you think about all the stuff that's going on around me and that's going on in society and what the politicians are saying and what the news is saying and what social media is telling me. I think those people realize that the amount of fear or messages that might make a person feel afraid or that would motivate a person to make a decision based off of fear is much more than what would normally be the case. Even people who live their lives knowing that war might happen or had happened at some point during their life, or natural disasters, they didn't have something in their ear all the time or like a screen in their face all the time telling them this is how the next war is going to look. They would have just gone back to their families and they would have gotten into a rhythm of life, and then they can just focus on flourishing in or growing in virtue, but without having the bombardment of fear. And so I think for those of us who have realized that, we're really looking for opportunities to talk more about it and how we can overcome it, and where are these messages hitting on a wound in our own life, and what can we do to work through that, so that we can resist better and also know when to switch it off and say, look, it doesn't matter what's going on. What matters is that I'm close to God, because at the end of the day, I have to come home to him anyway.
For sure. Yeah, you're right, Chris. We consume so many useless fears through media these days. So many of them are useless. Reading about all the bad things happening in the church, in the world, and society. and it's actually not useful at all.
Yeah.
There's other things that we should fear, not
Yeah.
those things that we're reading on the news. So, I think that we were going to talk about one specific thing. Why is it that we tend to just look over fear as a problem,
Yeah.
or even as a vice? Why do we just
Yeah.
overlook it?
Yeah. I had a
and that's-
thought just before you break that open, Father. I had a thought at the beginning when you were defining it, and you were basically talking about inordinate versus ordinate, because you define fear, or you define fortitude as a virtue that regulates fear, which means that it's not just about conquering all fear so that we don't feel afraid anymore. And so there is good and bad, but I think if we don't examine ourselves well enough, then we may see normal as good. And everyone's got a different benchmark for normal, of like, what's a normal amount of fear? Well, if you're a person who was raised in a household where your parents were anxious, and I was, then your baseline is anxiety. Like, there's a level of underlying anxiety there all the time, and that feels normal. And so it's like you can become comfortable with the norm, even though the norm actually includes a lot of inordinate fear. But just because it feels normal, that doesn't mean it's good. I just wanted to say that
Exactly.
before you break that open.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we talk about fear a lot? Like, for example, if you were to read an examination of conscience, you never like, oh, now we come to the sin of fear. No one ever thinks
Yeah,
about that. It's like, oh,
no,
did I get angry? Oh, maybe. Did I miss mass? Did I not pay attention during my prayers? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Did I fear inordinately? What does that mean? No one ever thinks
yeah.
about that.
So here's a question. Here's a question for you, Father. Based on what we've heard so far, to be very clear, is fear always sinful or not? And when is it not? And when is it?
Yeah. First of all, no, it's not always sinful. I don't want people to think that, because they're in an airplane and they're afraid of flying, that they're committing a sin, because that's not true. I don't want them to think that a child who's afraid of the dark is committing a sin, because that's not fearful. That's not sinful fear. So we also have to recognize too that a lot of the time our fears are so like subconscious or unconscious that they're not even blameworthy. So, for example, if you have a fear of society and speaking to people, like it's such a subconscious thing or unconscious thing. It's not even a sin. Remember, one quality of sin is that it must be chosen. It must be in the will. It must be about something that's bad. So we shouldn't really call those things sins. Sinful. So answering your question, what sorts of fears are sinful? Well, this is a difficult question. We can't just answer it, because there are many different people and many different situations in 1,001 different circumstances. So, St. Thomas says that cowardice is sinful. Okay, we know that. Now, what are some examples of cowardice? Well, that's a more difficult thing to describe. Um, maybe, for example, when parents don't correct their children, even though they know they should be corrected, when they don't correct them out of fear, that can be a sin, because it's the parent's duty to correct. So understand that. Or other things like, being afraid to express one's faith in public can be a sin. I'm afraid to make the sign of the cross. I'm afraid to say that I'm a Christian or something like that. That can be a sin. Those are some very basic examples, or maybe me as a priest. If my superiors said, Father Wallace, we've chosen you to, be the district superior of Australia and New Zealand. And I say, Oh, I'm not doing that. I'm too scared. No, I'm not doing that. No. Well, that can be a sin of inordinate fear because under obedience, I should say yes, is God's will. It's spoken through my superiors, and I'm still saying no because I'm scared. So that could be a sinful fear. Those are just some examples of sinful fear. There's a great example of sinful fear in the Gospels. Well, there are many great examples, but there's one that we actually don't look at too much. This really concerns kind of magnanimity, but magnanimity is a part of fortitude, so let's talk about it anyway. In the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, we read that a certain master had 3 servants, and he gave one 5 talents, one 2 talents, and one 1 talent. Remember, by talent here, we mean a currency, money, coins, or whatever. And we read that, the first 2 servants, they took their talents and they traded and they gained more talents. So the master applauds them for it. But the last servant, the one that got 1 talent, what did he do? He took his talent and he dug it into the ground. Now, when the master comes back and asks him what he did, what does the servant say? The servant says, "Master, I know that you are a very stern man and you're difficult. And I was afraid, so I buried my talent." Now, how does the master reply to him? He says, "You wicked and slothful servant." So he condemns him. He punishes him because that was a sinful fear. He should have used that talent that God gave him, but he didn't. Therefore, he sinned. Wow, might this apply to us who have been given talents? By that we mean souls. You have been given souls in your life. A soul, 4 children to care for, a wife to care for. I've been given talents in my life, many souls to care for. And at my judgment, I can't just be like, "Lord, I was afraid, so I didn't help them as much as I could have." I can't expect God to just say, "Well, it's all right. You were afraid. Don't worry." He might say to me, "You're a wicked servant. Because I gave you those talents, you had the power to care for them, but you were too scared." So that's an example of sinful fear. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it takes on our part a careful examination of conscience to actually work out, okay, I feel fear in these situations, and then how do I act based off that? And examine the action and whether the action's reasonable and good or not. Whether
Yeah.
it's a prudent thing, for example, to bringing in another virtue here, but whether it's a prudent thing to speak out about my faith in the workplace when it's being questioned. It probably is an opportunity to be courageous, and it's probably a sin of fear to not say anything. And then, the other example that we spoke about off the air was if there's a toxic work culture in a workplace, or peer pressure happening maybe among young people at a school or at a university. In that context, we could fear losing our place in a group as a member of a group, and it's going to take careful discernment. We can't tell you the exact answer right now, but it's going to take careful discernment to work out whether we speak up or not.
That's for sure. Yeah, the one in the workplace is a really difficult example because sometimes someone should speak up about their faith, but sometimes it'd be better for them not to, because they have to care for their family and keep their job. So this is one of these things where it depends on the individual case. But I think it is kind of a common thing that in our secular society, we are all kind of afraid to show our faith. For example, try this sometime. Just have a rosary in your hand and walk around with the rosary in your hand. when you go into the store, go into the mall, in the park, and you're going to feel, a lot of people feel uncomfortable, like, this is weird, people looking at me. But why should you fear? There's nothing to fear there. It's like, I'm spreading the gospel by doing this.
Yeah. It's very rare where it would happen where somebody would come up to you and be like, "What are you doing with those beads in your hand?"
Yeah, exactly.
How dare you walk around with beads in your hand?
Yeah, so I think we have too many fears of what people are going to think of us. Yeah, we're too fearful.
Yeah. I agree with that, Father, and I think it comes to another big part of this. Another big subtopic, I think, is vulnerability. I mean, authentic, good vulnerability. And I think this is a challenge specifically for men, because I think men struggle more than women with being vulnerable or finding somebody who they trust enough to be vulnerable with themselves. It's like that whole concept of Adam and Eve covering themselves up when they were cast from the garden. It's a covering of vulnerability. Like we want to cover those things that are weak in ourselves, or those things that we fear, because then other people will pick on us or take advantage because they might see us as weak. But actually, it's like a paradox, or we see it as a paradox when we first think of it, that we have to uncover, obviously in the right context with a trusted person. We have to uncover those things before others. Otherwise, we're not going to actually become truly strong. We're not truly going to become fortuitous and be able to do the life and death thing, the martyrdom thing, unless we've been able to go there with somebody and be vulnerable with somebody, at least one person, I would say, who we can share those kinds of struggles with.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. Just like a child too. It's the same example as a child. A child has to, what he's going to do before he goes on stage, he's probably going to cry. And he's going to have to talk to someone, and someone's going to have to convince him. He's going to be in a pretty bad state for a little bit. But then once he admits that, and okay, I can do this. So,
and I think the other big thing is people realize that it starts with doing the thing whilst feeling afraid anyway. Like it's not a prerequisite of courage that you don't feel afraid first and then you do the thing. Usually you have to start doing the thing that you're afraid of doing, and you actually feel the severe discomfort of fear in the midst of doing the action. But then you realize when you persevere in the action that this confidence begins to grow and the fear begins to dissipate.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
I think we might wrap things up here for the end of our first episode, just as an overview of the virtue of fortitude, and we'll break down the 4 sub virtues in a couple of episodes. So it's going to be magnanimity, patience, perseverance, and munificence. Is that correct? Have I got them all?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Father. So I'd appreciate if everyone would give this video, or if you're listening to it on podcast, a like, positive review, share it around, would be fantastic. Also, if you'd like to become a very basic patron of this podcast, you can go to ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/Lionhearts and you can buy us a coffee. You can get us a coffee at only $5 Australian per month. And especially if you might be tuning in from Father Wallace's homeland, that's really cheap for you. Like $5 Australian is nothing.
Yeah, it's like three American dollars.
Yeah. So please do support us. And before we close it off, Father, would you like to say a closing prayer for everybody watching or listening?
Of course. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought the intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Father, and God
You're welcome.
bless. And we'll see you next time for magnanimity.
Awesome.
Everyone, stay tuned.